As Facebook agrees to a truce with the Australian government, it's taking a clear side in Myanmar, showing its support for the pro-democracy movement. The tech giant is banning the military and military-linked accounts from using its platform. The move comes after the army seized power in a coup earlier this month, prompting weeks of mass demonstrations. Our next guest says Facebook is having a direct impact on world events, which shows just how powerful it is. Vivian Schiller is the Executive Director of Aspen Digital. She's also the former President and CEO of NPR and the former Global Chair of News at Twitter. And she joins us now. Vivian, fantastic to have you on the show. I'm glad that you want to talk about Myanmar because I want to too. It actually reminds me in some ways of the social media silencing of former US President Donald Trump. It doesn't matter what he says or didn't say or what Myanmar and who in Myanmar is in the right. It's a demonstration of extreme power. And in Myanmar, it's absolute.
Yeah, that's without a doubt. Thanks for having me, Julia. So there's in many ways, this is much more consequential than the banning or blocking of Donald Trump's account on Facebook. First of all, the important thing to know is that in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet. That is basically the vast majority of people, mostly on their mobile devices. That is how they access information. It's not just one of many sources like it is here. So as you said, Facebook has blocked the military, all the subunits, the army-controlled media, many of the ministries, and also not only blocked those entities, but also blocked ads from government-owned businesses. So they're hitting the military, both in terms of their ability to communicate with people, win hearts and minds, and also economically.
Yeah, a private company is making these kind of decisions for the outcome of in Myanmar. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is in charge.
He has put his thumb on the scale, and by thumb I mean the vast global power of Facebook, which is basically, like I said, everything in Myanmar. So, you know, their statement was that they blocked these accounts because they said they were severe human rights abuses, clear risk for violence, very similar to some of the statements we heard about Trump. But imagine if in the United States, this is akin to Facebook blocking all of the government departments, entities, and shutting down the ability for all U.S. agencies to communicate with the public. And there were very little alternatives. So this is much more profound in many ways, and harkens to what will happen in other countries. I mean, there's been enough controversy around blocking Trump, but this is literally calling winners and losers effectively in Myanmar. You may agree with the sides that they have chosen, but the precedent is absolutely tremendous and slightly terrifying.
I mean, we've gone from one extreme to the other, where Facebook and some of these other social media giants say, look, we're not going to police the internet, we're not going to police content, to an absolute and extreme decision like this. I mean, I don't even know, and perhaps you can answer better, where should the regulators stand on this when we're at this degree of extreme power, and which regulators when we're talking about a nation like Myanmar? I just want to remind our viewers of a quote, and I used this earlier this week on this show, from the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, in light of the decision they made to try and make Facebook and other social media platforms pay for news. He said of Facebook, they may be changing the world, but that doesn't mean they run it. Prescient in light of these events. I know. What do you think of Australia?
Not so sure that's entirely true.
I know.
I think in many ways, you know, we've all been following, and you know, you led with the new law that's taken place in Australia, and that, of course, that story is very consequential in terms of the decision that that Facebook made to shut off all access to news accounts on Facebook in Australia. They have now gotten their way in terms of some changes to the legal system. But like I said, in many ways, this move in Myanmar, which is getting less attention globally, I'm glad we're talking about it, is in many ways much more consequential in terms of who can make the call, who can make the decision. I mean, you know, we could argue whether this is, many people would disagree whether they have any real authority or it's a fig leaf, but the Facebook Oversight Board is going to be taking up the decision about Facebook's blocking of Donald Trump. If they if they ruled, again, this is an independent body that Facebook set up. If their ruling is that Trump should be reinstated, I think that will have that is allegedly binding, and I think it will have consequences for moves like this in the future. We'll know more about that, I think, in April.
Vivian, the reason why I'm tying the two things is because, and you said it about Myanmar, Facebook is effectively picking a side here. And I think one of the criticisms, even of the progress perhaps that we've seen in Australia to try and protect some of the local news sources that were going out of business while news was being viewed on social media, is that now Facebook is in a position where it will do a deal and there will be bargaining over what they pay these news media sources. But if they don't do a deal, that news doesn't appear. So they now get to pick the news effectively too. So they pick sides in Myanmar, and they're picking the news sources that will be appearing on social media. And the vast majority of Australians get their news from social media, according to surveys. This is a frightening degree of power.
It is. And frankly, that power has always been there. I think these two incidents just have made it more visible. I mean, without a doubt, the influence on American politics, for example, through the algorithmic decisions and the way that Facebook is structured and Facebook groups has had a tremendous impact on public opinion, the rise of extremism, the rise of conspiracy theories. But what we're seeing is a much sort of clearer, so to speak, overt decision making on the part of Facebook. And it's hard to imagine this is not going to lead to some very serious consequences with regulators around the world.
That's what I was going to ask you. Where does this lead?
Yeah, I mean, it concerns me, frankly. On the one hand, clearly the free market is not necessarily working the way that we would like. On the other hand, if you look at Australia, that was not a great situation. I mean, there were no really, there were no sort of, heroes. When you think about heroes and villains, I'm not sure there were any heroes in there. I thought that the legislation from the Australian government overreached in terms of trying to charge platforms for links. I think, Google, which made big payments to Murdoch's organization. Facebook took all of the news sites down, and then finally had their way to a certain degree. The losers here potentially are the public and also the small news organizations. To be fair, Facebook and Google have said they will be funding those news organizations. I hope that's true. But because at the end, what matters is the public's right to know and the access that the public has to quality news and information.
Yeah, and we're showing that tackling tech is really tough. Vivian Schiller, great to have you on the show. Thank you. Executive Director of Aspen Digital.